Hello everyone, and a great big welcome to all of you to our Benefit Risk seminar today. Thank you for bearing with us while we were letting everyone join. I believe we have registrations in the region of about 500 of you watching us today, so I hope you really enjoy your time with us. There has been a huge interest in this event, both in the UK and from around the world, so welcome to everyone. I am Marguerite Hunter-Blair. I am Chief Executive of Play Scotland, and have been a member of the Play Safety Forum for over 25 years, and I am today's chair of the event. This free Play Safety Forum webinar has been sponsored by Sutcliffe Play and organised by Play Scotland. So I'd like to do a big shout out thank you to Sutcliffe Play and to Sherry Morgan and our team at Play Scotland for organising this event for you to enjoy today. Today's event will introduce us to the groundbreaking new international standard in risk management. This new benefit risk standard, ISO 4980-2023, marks a welcome shift to a balanced, thoughtful approach to safety in play and leisure contexts. It draws on the expertise of leading UK and global play safety experts and advocates, and is in tune with the health and safety high-level statement on children's play from 2012. Today we have brought together a panel of people who have been instrumental in bringing this new standard about. They have not been chosen for their good looks in particular, but because they have been instrumental, absolutely key in bringing about the changes that we have been seeking in the play sector for a very long time. Many of us here will have felt at many times that we have been on a hobbit-like quest, trying to bring about change in practice and culture around risk assessment and children's play. And this seminar is intended to help us on our journey. It is going to tell us a story, the benefit risk story. It's going to explain why the new international standard matters and how we can all use it to improve children's play opportunities by helping to implement the standard in practice, and not just implement the standard, but the spirit of the standard in practice. And there will be questions to ask, question opportunities afterwards, so you can actually ask the panel directly their questions. And I'm just going to explain to you now how you're going to do your questions. You'll see a blue button marked Ask Questions. So at any time during the presentations, please type in your question. If you could put in your name and your organisation, that would be great, thank you. I know many of you are in different time zones, and some of you might even be joining us in the middle of the night. But please, if you could just remember to put in your name and organisation, that will help us. And at the end of the session, at the end of the presentations, we're going to take a short break, and then we'll come back to the Q&A session. So now I look forward to introducing our first speaker, and I'm delighted to ask Tim Gill to set the scene for our story with his presentation, The Road to ISO. So Tim Gill is a global advocate for children's outdoor play and mobility. He is an independent scholar, writer and consultant based in London. He is the author of the best-selling Urban Playground, How Child-Friendly Planning and Design Can Save Cities. And many of us might have the next one, No Fear, Growing Up in a Risk-Averse Society. Tim is a UK Design Council Ambassador and Churchill Fellow. Tim has been involved in the UK Play Safety Forum for over 25 years and became its chair in 2021. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you very much, Marguerite. It's kind of thrilling to be here. There's quite a lot of tech going on behind the scenes, but I'm really, as Marguerite said, going to be setting the scene. I do just want to thank Marguerite for her role and the Play Scotland team for making this happen. So yes, I'm going to talk about the road to the ISO, and The next slide I'm going to use is one that some people may be familiar with, and it really provides a kind of, I think, a really helpful starting point for thinking about children's everyday freedom. So what you're looking at is a map that essentially maps out the roaming range of 4 generations of children. And they're all 8 years old, but they're in 4 generations of the same family. So you can see how what started out with the great-grandfather as a big area that he could travel across the city, about 6 miles, 10 kilometers on his own, shrinks with each generation until the son today, and you can see a dot in the top left of the map. So I think it's a really fruitful way to start conversations and thinking with adults about children's play, children's outdoor play in particular, and their mobility, and kind of how those of us who are involved in creating play opportunities can kind of justify giving children a bit of freedom and agency in their lives. Because what that map speaks to, I think, apart from anything else, is children's appetite for experience and adventure. So, some starting points that I'm not going to discuss in any detail, but just kind of given, if you like, assumptions for thinking about safety, is that children seek out opportunities for risky play. That risky play brings benefits, but also, of course, the possibility of harm, and that hence a balanced and thoughtful approach is needed. And I've just pictured a couple of scholars whose work some of you will be familiar with, Mariana Brusoni and Ellen Sandsetter, and I thoroughly recommend looking into the work of both those writers and academics who've really laid bare just how important risky play is in children's lives. But this is a tricky topic area for various reasons, because we're talking about children, but also because we're talking about risk. And one of the things about risk is that there's not a kind of objective standard. So if you think about your own risk thermostat, what's your own appetite for risk? Well, there's a spectrum. So you might be the kind of person whose idea of a nice time is to just relax in front of the TV with a glass of wine on the sofa. Alternatively, you might be the kind of person whose idea of fun is to stand on the edge of tall buildings and jump off them with a tiny parachute strapped on your back. Or, as I suspect, you might be somewhere in between. Now, the challenge here, when we're thinking about making decisions about safety and risk, is that there's no one right place to be on this spectrum. And so thinking about our kind of appetite and the way that we choose risk and engage with uncertain situations is partly a matter of subjective judgment and our personalities. However, I think what we can say, and this quote brings out, is that excessively risk-averse approaches are problematic. And here is a quote from Peter Heseltine, who I can remember from the early days in my involvement in the Play Safety Forum, no longer with us, but he was a leading playground inspector, and he wrote back in 1995, and I quote, "We have made playgrounds so monumentally boring that any self-respecting child will go somewhere else to play, somewhere more interesting and usually more dangerous." And actually, when I reread this quote just a few weeks ago, I thought, actually, of course, where do children and young people go today to have their thrills? Well, it's often online. So even though in some respects children's lives are different, I think in that insight still holds. So it's incumbent on us to create opportunities for children to play that speak to that appetite for uncertainty and challenge. And that's why colleagues and I, for many years on the Play Safety Forum, argued for a shift away from the standard approach to risk management. You can see it in the slide here. In essence, it's what you might call a risk reduction mindset, so that risk is to be reduced and that the job of those involved in managing risk is to remove the possibilities of harm. We need to move away from that approach and instead take an approach that's about balance, that's about weighing up the risks and the benefits. Crucially, the benefits that come because children are engaging with uncertainty. And I'm going to steal a page from David Ball's work now and talk about the wobbly bridge. You can see an image here of a wobbly rope bridge in a playground in London. And what this image nicely captures is that, of course, children like to go on wobbly bridges. They want to figure out how to get across. There's that kind of butterflies in the stomach as they're stepping out. Are they brave enough? What might happen? So risk is intrinsic to that experience. But if you're in a factory, you would never put in a wobbly bridge. No good can come of a wobbly bridge in a workplace setting. So that really goes to the heart of how thinking about risk is different when we're thinking about children's play. So I promised you a kind of story about the road to risk-benefit, or as it is now called, benefit-risk. We maybe come back to that. And really this journey, in a formal sense, I think started in the early 2000s when the Play Safety Forum put together a statement, and that argued for a thoughtful and balanced approach. A few years later, the forum got support from the UK government to put together a guide to managing risk. A few years after that, in 2012, the Health and Safety Executive, so that's the UK's regulatory body for safety, put out its own high-level statement supporting risk-benefit. And I also want to mention, especially because we're here in Edinburgh, in Scotland, the Scottish Care Inspectorate, which is the Scottish regulatory body for out-of-school childcare, amongst other things, again, explicitly supported risk-benefit in its guidance, My World Outdoors. And I can just share with you a quote from the HSE statement there. I'm not going to read it out because you can find it online, but I think it captures, you know, when you have a body whose role is regulating safety, being so clear about the value of play because of it's exposing children to the realities of the world in which they live. That's a real milestone. Speaking of milestones, internationally, looking beyond the shores of the UK, we've seen other administrations, other organisations taking up and responding to the risk-benefit or benefit-risk philosophy. And again, I've listed a few there, ranging from reforms to the European standards for playgrounds, a key general comment from the UN Convention or the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, 2013, statements from Canada, from Australia, and then last year, the new ISO standard. So, I mean, you may be thinking this all kind of talk of standards and, you know, these organisations with three-letter acronyms sounds a bit bureaucratic, but actually this has made a difference. You know, I know from my involvement as chair of the Play Safety Forum, but also from my involvement in Forest School and in urban design, there are schemes and programmes coming forward today that would not have happened were it not for this more progressive, balanced approach. So you can see some images there of playgrounds, from London, from Australia. We have programmes running Forest School, out-of-school childcare. And I want to close with a final image. And I'm just going to invite you to look at this image for a few seconds and try and guess where it is. This is actually from a state primary school playground in the southeast of England. Okay, it may look like it's from the trenches. And this is a school that has adopted the OPAL programme for outdoor play in school playtimes, and that programme is running in hundreds, maybe over 1,000 schools in the UK and beyond, and it's the risk-benefit philosophy that gives head teachers and school managers the kind of green light to create these opportunities. So, thinking back to my first slide, we can't turn the clock back, but what we can do is compensate children for that loss of experience that I talked about. And in order to do that, while also, of course, taking due responsibility as adults and as service providers, we need to take a balanced and thoughtful approach. And that's where risk-benefit or benefit-risk comes into play. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was a great start to today's seminar and a good start, an introduction to the journey that we've all been on. And I'm sure everyone joining us today has been on this journey at a certain stage in their time. So Andy Yates will now outline the standards journey and tell us why they matter. Welcome to Andy Yates. Andy is Technical Director of HAGS, a leading supplier of children's playground equipment and associated products. As an ambassador for HAGS, Andy has spent his whole career championing the benefits that play provides for children and the wider community. Andy is currently chair at SEN's European Technical Committee for Children's Play, and he's been a member of the UK Play Safety Forum for the last 30 years. Welcome, Andy.
Thanks, Marguerite. Welcome everyone online as well. This is a new experience for me. So over the next 4 slides, I'll go through a brief standards backdrop and history, which has led to the recent publication of the ISO. So I'll just start with sort of going through, for those that may not be familiar, who publishes standards? Well, obviously, there are a number of organisations at a national level. So BSI in the UK, we have ASTM in the US, CSA in Canada, Standards Australia in Australia, to name a few. And then obviously if you go up to a level from that, in Europe we have the CEN organisation, so CEN is the Centre of European Norms. CEN has 34 member countries, and just to make it clear for everyone, it's not the same as the EU. There are a number of non-EU members of CEN, such as the UK. And for those nations that sign up to CEN, they make an agreement that if a standard is published through CEN, it will be adopted at a national level, and any national standards that may be conflicting will be withdrawn. So going up to the global level, the organisation is ISO, which we're specifically referencing today. And this is an independent organisation, and it will capture inputs from any country that has an interest in that particular topic, and the results of that will be published as an ISO standard, as a global standard. So just for navigation, it's often helpful to see where we've been to help orientate the general direction of travel. So this slide is based on my personal journey, which is obviously rooted in the UK, and it may or may not be mirrored by others. So first of all, I'd just like to say that public expectations, or sort of the mood of the crowd, if you like, is always a strong influence on drafting of standards. And consumer representatives, are a strong input to that. So at a European level, we have an organisation called ANIC, which has always been a very strong contributor to these discussions. Standards don't generally are not generally at the leading edge, the state of the art, so they're normally lagging behind that due to the process and due to the public expectation input. So if we start back in 1959, that was the first time a British standard was published for playground equipment. At that time, it was more of a material specification. If you wanted to know how to manufacture a swing, you'd go to that standard and it would tell you more or less exactly which piece of metal you needed to use. And in terms of the public expectation or the mood of the crowd at that time, it was different to what we have today. So, at that time, concrete surfaces were okay in playgrounds. There was very much, I think, a sort of a that'll teach them culture in terms of children having accidents. So the general direction at that time, that was sort of the starting point, certainly in terms of the standards input to the story. So coming on from that, the first standard I was involved with, which was published originally in 1979, then later in 1986, was BS 5696. That adopted what is called a hazard approach. So it didn't specifically tell you how to build a piece of playground equipment. It just detailed collectively the hazards that you needed to consider and possible controls that you needed to consider as part of that construction. In terms of the public expectation, the general direction was at that time, we need more safety. So from that initial we'll teach them approach, there was a growing public expectation that there were too many accidents in playgrounds. There were a number of safety campaigners. So for those of you that are old enough may remember Esther Ranson and her program, That's Life. And she spoke at length about, how unacceptable it was that some of these accidents were happening to children in playgrounds. So the direction of travel at that time was very much children need more safety. And the standards organisations, did react to that. And much of that thinking was published in the BS 5696. And obviously, that was where we were at that time. What I then noticed, which was around the early 90s, was I think there was definitely a pivot in terms of public expectation. So we had organisations like the Play Safety Forum, as Tim was talking about, which was sort of saying, how important it is that children need to learn about risk. We have the advocates such as Peter that are saying playgrounds are boring. We've also got people saying children wrapped in too much cotton wool is not a good thing. Helicopter parenting is not a good thing. So from about the early 90s, there was definitely a pivot. And from a culture where the pressure on the standards committees was we need more safety, I think after that pivot point, the direction of flow changed. And it was much more a case of, well, in fact, perhaps we need a bit more challenge, we need a bit more risk in our playgrounds. So that was the backdrop that led to the publication of the first European standard in 1998, which was EN 1176. So there's been later revisions of that in 2008 and 2017. And I think that has provided a good foundation for this following work of the ISO. So just thinking about why do standards matter? Just a few bullet points on the slide. I'll sort of, quickly go through. So a standards forum does give a place where all different stakeholders can align, find a consensus on what appropriate guidance may be. That guidance, as I said, will generally follow public expectations, the mood of the crowd. It won't generally direct it. It gives permissions to provide something that may have been too risky to underwrite alone. And I think this is often sort of forgotten in terms of standards, is standards will often say, well, yes, you can do this. That can be helpful in certain situations where you want to provide something which, as Andy Yates doing a risk assessment, I might have struggled with, to have sort of a broader body such as a standard saying, well, yeah, that's okay to do. That is helpful with the necessary controls. Standards do have a wealth of information that provide an excellent reference source for anyone that's new to a subject area. But it's important to say that standards are not black and white. They purposely have some flexibility so that you can have some design creativity whilst working to the standard. So anyone that's working with standards does have to have a knowledge of the principles behind them. Rigidly following the text in a black and white form is not necessarily helpful. It does provide a market territory benchmark, which is helpful for product certification. Obviously, that's good for trade. It establishes the rules of the game if you're in a particular industry. Playground standards are not mandated in the UK, so they're not a legal requirement in the UK. They are in some other markets. They are mandated, but in the UK they're not. But even when they're not mandated, they do provide a helpful tool so that you can demonstrate discharge of a legal duty of care. So following in the UK in particular, the Health and Safety at Work Act or Product Safety Directive, it is a tool that's helpful to demonstrate that you are in compliance with that duty of care or you fulfilled that duty of care. So at a global level, so at the ISO level that we're talking about today, again, it provides a document that can be referenced by all stakeholders, which is helpful. And then importantly for some in the industry, it does also provide reference points for legal judgments. So, for some people, sort of the risk of legal prosecution is sort of perhaps a bigger risk than sort of children's play risks. And from that point of view, standards can be very helpful as a way of establishing, what is the best way to produce something or to provide something. So just finally, I wanted to beam up a couple of extracts of the EN 1176 standard. So as I said, this was originally published in 2008. And I think this sort of was part of the foundation that was used for the recent work on the ISO. And the standard makes clear in this introduction, that risk-taking is an essential feature and a benefit in play provision. It also states categorically that accidents will happen, and this doesn't necessarily mean that something's wrong. So just to quickly go through the points, so it's not the purpose of the requirements of this standard to lessen the contribution that playground equipment makes to child's development. Risk-taking is an essential feature of play provision. Play provision aims to offer children the chance to encounter acceptable risks as part of a stimulating, challenging, and controlled learning environment. Play provision should aim at managing the balance between the need to offer risk and the need to keep children safe from serious harm. In play provision, exposure to some degree of risk might be a benefit. Children need to cope with risk, and this leads to bumps and bruises and even occasionally a broken limb. So it was great to get that philosophy into the introduction of EN 1176 in 2008. And certainly that 1176 standard was built on this philosophy. And it was built on trying to find this generic balance between exposing children to beneficial risk, but yet trying to keep them safe from serious harm. So on that note, I'd like to hand over.
Okay, thank you so much, Andy. That was really interesting, actually, to reflect on the journey that we have been on. So now, welcome to Harry Harbottle. Harry is going to tell us the next part of the story, why standard organisations wanted a new standard, look at some definitions, and explain why playground inspectors need to know about play value. Now, Harry was actually on the committee that revised this new standard, but he has been involved in campaigning on children's issues for nearly 40 years, including many aspects of play at a European level since 1986, when he was appointed as an independent expert on child safety and play to the European Commission. During the 80s and 90s, Harry sat on the European Standard Institutions Committee's drafting standards for toy safety and playground equipment safety. It's where he first heard the phrase, as much play as possible, as much safety as necessary. This became a mantra for campaigning for a better balance between risk and benefit. Harry is a former long-time board member and chair of Play Scotland, and he is currently a member of the ISO working groups on benefit risk assessment for sports and recreation facilities and framework for the competence of playground inspectors. Harry is also the co-author of Free to Play, a guide to creating accessible and inclusive public play spaces, a Scottish play strategy publication. Welcome, Harry.
Thank you, Marguerite. And hello to everybody out there. And I feel sorry for those that are waiting up into the early hours to be able to listen to us, and I hope we provide value for money. When we started this process of looking at a standard in this area, there are questions as to why there was a need for such a standard. Many knew that there were already plenty standards, international standards and national standards on risk assessment and risk management. However, as the foreword of this new standard says, these were written with the intention of providing methods of managing risk and preventing work-related injuries and ill health via the elimination of hazards and minimization of occupational health and safety risks by taking effective preventative and protective measures. As Tim's example showed earlier, things are different in the world of children, the world of sport, and the world of recreation. In those areas, there's an expectation that the user is making an implicit trade-off between the benefits and the inherent risks of the activity, including the potential for harm, and his case of even a broken limb. So it was recognized that we needed a standard guide to guide us on how to conduct benefit risk assessments that explicitly brings together the consideration of the benefits as well as the risks of sport and recreation into a single evaluation. This immediately separated sport and recreation from the world of occupational health and safety, where the goal is the elimination or the minimization of risk. So using this benefit risk approach, it recognized the need for making these trade-offs in achieving a balance that maximizes the overall social utility and the public good. First of all, if you look to the scope of the standard, the scope is quite wide. It's not just about play. It's about sports and recreation, sports facilities and equipment. And of course, playgrounds and playground equipment fit into this recreational part. And that's the part, of course, we'll concentrate on today. For those of you who are not used to reading standards, they usually start by defining the main terms that are specified in the standard itself. And I've picked out a few relevant ones today. First of all, activity, which clearly straight away talks about providing benefit which can have an associated risk. And then the word benefit itself is anything that has a helpful or good effect or something intended to help. If we look at the term benefit risk itself, it's defined as a concept which acknowledges sport and recreation as inevitable and inherent trade-off. So you can start getting the theme that you were talking about, what Tim talked about earlier, about the balance that we have to have between benefit and risk. There's an inevitable inherent trade-off between the benefits of a sport or recreation activity and some of the risks which it can pose. And a benefit risk assessment considers both risks and benefits in parallel when making the decision. There are some notes to this benefit definition in the standard, benefit risk assessment definition in the standard, which are here. First of all, it shows that in the first bullet point, this balanced approach involves judgment. You can't do it in a scientific way. It's done from experience, knowledge, prior knowledge, and so on. So it will involve judgment and not numerical type risk assessments. It appropriately takes account of local circumstances, and the risk sometimes is not apparent to the user, but we should focus on the harm that cannot be evaluated and determined by the user during the activity. More simply, you're talking about children or young people being able to see the risk, being able to understand the risk, and being able to manage or learn to manage the risk. Another important definition, and there's plenty of pages of definitions in the standard, is graduated challenge. And this is very important when you're finding the balance. It accepts in that graduated challenge different level of competences of users. And this has to be recognized by the people doing the benefit risk assessment. In the end, you have to judge whether the risk is tolerable or whether the benefits outweigh the risks of both. You can see this particularly in some sports like mountain biking or skiing, where color coding gives indication to people of different levels of competence, different levels of risk. This picture in particular shows another aspect which I think we should consider. When we're talking about graduated challenge, this is very important. An American study demonstrated that overprotection of children with medical condition or with a disability can reduce their self-esteem and sense of belonging, as well as impede independence. So it's very important, even for children suffering from a disability, that we talk about them in having, being able to benefit from risky play and needing graduated challenge. This child, for instance, in a school in Ballymena, Northern Ireland, is on a piece of equipment which is very challenging for him, but was intended for children aged around 3 to 4. But for him it was a real challenge, and it was a real sense of achievement when he managed to cross this bridge and then went on to further challenges. At the same time as we're developing the benefit risk assessment standard, there were some consequences that we looked at in this standard here, which is for the framework for the competence of playground inspectors and playground maintenance technicians. The consequence of doing a benefit risk assessment and bringing it into the play world was that inspections could now not only be solely a technical inspection, but needed inspectors to know how and why children of all abilities play. There was a growing realization with this, and so this standard was developed in parallel. Now, according to this guide, inspectors would need different levels of competence depending on whether they carry out different levels of inspection, such as visual inspection, operational inspection, annual main inspection, or post-installation inspection. There's not time to go into these different levels or these different levels of knowledge, but the subject areas of the knowledge which they are expected to display different levels of competence include the levels knowledge of the standard, technical knowledge, benefit risk analysis and risk analysis, technical production of equipment, environmental questions, questions of legislation, but this last one, this knowledge levels of child development is the most interesting in today's context. So the different levels are shown here, and it's very important to notice that. If it's a minimal level, say you're just doing visual inspections, you have to understand that children develop different skills gradually as they grow. Basic, understand basic principles how play assists child development, going through medium, and high, the ultimate level for inspectors, is the understanding of needs of children regarding play and risk, and how children develop various skills and what needs less competent children have. So it really puts a new onus on inspectors when they're doing benefit risk assessment to understand these child development issues so that they can balance benefit and risk. I've attached here on the slide a graphic showing the wonderful work that Bob Hughes did on the 16 play types, identifying 16 play types. And very often a good start would be to just know knowledge of these play types when you're starting to develop a knowledge of understanding of how children play. Like Andy, I'll quote some extracts from the standard itself. And I think one point to realize here is very often people, as Andy said, it's not black and white. You don't just go to the particular part of the standard and start reading it and applying it. You have to understand the context of the standard, the scope of the standard. So here's some things from the scope. There's an expectation that the user is making an implicit trade-off between benefits and inherent risks. Participation sport involves exposure to risk, not necessarily a bad thing. Beneficial risk is a good thing. Children seek risky situations. Different approaches can be used to compare risks, and so on and so on. Here it's reinforcing the same message, now accepted at an international level. And I'd thank all my colleagues around the table for all contributing to this great step forward in the quality of children's life and children's play. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harry. That was very inspiring and takes us on the next step along the road. So next we are going to welcome Professor David Ball. David is now going to tell us what the implications are for a range of stakeholders. David is Professor of Risk Management at Middlesex University and Director of its Centre for Decision Analysis and Risk Management. David has worked with the children's play sector since the 80s and has been an advisor to the UK Play Safety Forum since its inception in 1993, quite a while ago. He has co-authored and authored academic papers, research reports and policy documents on play. And I'm just going to name a few. Playgrounds, Risks, Benefits and Choices for HSE books. Managing Risk in Play Provision, Implementation Guide for the Play Safety Forum. Children's Play Space and Safety Management, Rethinking the Role of Play Equipment Standards, with Bernard Spiegel and a few familiar names around this room, Tim Gill and Harry Harbottle. And Health, the Outdoors and Safety with Lawrence Ball King. But crucially for many of us and for the success of this new ISO, David from 2018 was the UK delegate to the ISO Working Group on Benefit Risk Assessment for Sport and Recreation. And this is the ISO that we're here to talk about today, published in 2023. So a huge welcome to David, and we owe you a huge debt of gratitude for the role you've played on this group. Thank you, David.
Well, thanks very much, Marguerite. Well, of course, there are a lot of people on the ISO working group, and I only contributed my small part, and if it weren't for the convener and many other delegates, we would never have got where we did. So it's nice to speak to you all out there. I can't imagine where you are. I'm an academic, and I'm aware that over the last 25 years there's been huge progress in academic research, which has been looking at the benefits of children and also adults of having exercise, regular exercise, and also being exposed to the natural environment. And this research is really substantial, convincing. There's no going back on it now. And it has even been said that exposure to the natural environment, taking exercise on a regular basis, is the best buy in public health. And I think that's right. I'm sure it's right. But this has not always been the case. And if I show you my first slide, the three images on here, they're rather quite funny, really, some of them. The first one is taken from a history of the Oxford and Cambridge boat race. Now, some time ago, Reverend somebody or other, I'm afraid I've forgotten his name, said that people who indulged in such activities would not live beyond the age of 30. So that was an attitude to vigorous exercise which prevailed in those days. And indeed, that also extended to people being exposed to the natural environment. Going out in the wilderness, going up mountains and stuff like that was seen as positively reckless and dangerous and asking for trouble. And I'm afraid to say that these sort of views, which we may now think are antiquated, linger on, actually. And, for instance, in the context of children's play, there's a little image there of children on the right. That image would cause a lot of debate, even today, because children clearly exposed to a risky situation. They're in the natural environment. It's mucky and dirty, and goodness knows what is lurking there. Some people will say that's great, and some people will say, not for my kids. And you can understand their points of view. So, and this situation has really been sort of, to some extent, promulgated by much of the advice on the management of risk, which has been proliferated over the last few decades in particular, the aim of which is to minimize risk and minimize exposure to hazards. So it has made this concern linger on. And so that's why this new ISO, is so special, because uniquely it puts the benefits of exposure to the natural environment and exposure to risk on an equal footing. And that's the crux of it. So from there, of course, this ISO has many implications. You bet it does. And I'm not expecting personally that these implications are going to be realized very quickly. It's going to take a period of time because it involves some social change and some adjustment to ways of thinking. But I'll just put a few pointers down here for the different groups which are impinged by the ISO. There are many of them, and I've only put down a few here, but for instance, designers and manufacturers. Well, it was on the working group of the ISO, it was said by the convener that designers and manufacturers often felt hemmed in by existing standards, which prescribed exactly what you could do and what you couldn't do. And the paradox was that while this might have reduced risk, it actually tended to lead to more mundane and unadventurous equipment for playgrounds and made it less attractive for kids. And the same thing was also happening in other spheres where sport and recreation was carried out. So it was important to try and get away from that syndrome because if you make things less attractive, then people are not going to be so involved with it. They're not going to have so much exercise. They're not going to go out and enjoy themselves so much. And so that has a downward health consequence. Although paradoxically, we were trying to improve safety, we're actually making lives better in some cases. So for providers and operators, as their stakeholders who are affected by this standard, people who provide playgrounds, for example, or play equipment or whatever. For some time, the mantra had been that what they would say would be that your safety is our number one priority. Well, that's a very noble thing to say, and I can fully appreciate that people would want to say that, but I really think what they should have been saying is your well-being is our number one priority, where well-being encompasses considerations of both safety from injury and your health, how we can improve your health. And improving people's health does mean getting them active, getting out in nature and doing things which are inherently risky. So there's got to be a trade-off. So from the point of view of providers and operators, the key is to have a policy. That's the number one thing, which sets out what your objectives are and how you're going to achieve them. And those objectives obviously include the well-being of the people within your constituency. Now, I'm not going to say anything about inspectors here because that's been well covered by Harry. As I move on to activity leaders, some of my favourite people, activity leaders, these could be teachers, play workers, adventure leaders, people of that kind. What this standard does is recognise that those people have important knowledge. It's called contributory expertise. This is really important. How do you get contributory expertise? By being involved in the play community on the daily, weekly basis, or maybe you're involved in, leading mountain expeditions or whatever. You get that contributory expertise. You can be taught it to some extent, but being involved in it is also enormously important. So those people have, for some time, some decades now, been kind of a bit hemmed in, I would say, by safety protocols and things of that kind. It's not that they didn't know about safety themselves, of course they did, and they had probably the best knowledge about it. But now this standard will, I hope, re-enfranchise them and get them back into the lead position, making decisions about the balance between benefit and risk. And then finally on this slide I've got users, the public. In an important legal case about 20 years ago, Lord Hobhouse said that the single-minded pursuit of safety interfered with the liberty of the citizen to engage with risk and enjoy the landscape. So it's about giving liberty back to people as well. So if people want to engage in risky activities, then they have a right to make that choice, and they shouldn't be prevented from doing it. So I will now move on to the next issue, which I want to talk about. How do you do benefit risk assessment? Well, some people will say this is very difficult. And in a sense, it's true, it is difficult. But, I mean, if I look at the animals in my garden, the blackbirds, for example, I can see they're sort of gauging whether they should go and get that worm or whether they should not get it because I'm standing a few meters away. They're doing a risk-benefit assessment. So if they can do it, then we can do it. That's what I would say. And you have to realize two things about it. Doing a benefit risk assessment means making a balanced decision which is subjective. It's a mental process. It's intuitive. There's no getting away from it. You can't write a mathematical formula to do it. You have to do this subjective thing. And the second thing to realize is there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's okay. That's how we make most of our decisions in life. And we have the human brain, which helps us do that. And it is still the case that the human brain is the most powerful computer in the known universe. So we've got a lot going for us. Now in this age, perhaps unfortunately, but it's a fact, one has to document one's risk assessment, or in this case, one's benefit risk assessment. There are some assistance out there to enable you to do that, because the Play Safety Forum has on its website a pro forma and a worked example. And I'm showing it here in this slide. So, I mean, basically what you're going to do is look at some activity which you wish to promote, and you're going to make a list of the benefits, and you're going to make a list of the risks associated with it. And the Play Safety Forum recommends that you do this in a narrative way, not with numbers, because it's almost impossible to put meaningful numbers on these commodities. So a narrative way is the only way you can do it. And then the next step is to strike the balance between the benefits and the risks which you've identified. How do you do that? Well, that's where your subjective mental process comes in. And you can bolster, I mean, that would be based upon your experience as someone who is immersed in that particular type of activity, whether it's children's play or mountaineering or whatever. You can also look around for precedents. Have other people done this thing, and how did it work out? Was it successful or not? Or you can go and look at the academic research if you have the inclination to do that. So there are a number of places where you can get this information from. And then you're pretty well obliged these days to write down your decision and the factors which influenced it. And then you implement them and you monitor progress. You may need to trim the sails if things don't work out as you expected. But the latter stage is here. This is just the standard risk management cycle. Nothing new there at all. The usual stuff. So finally, I would just like to point out that there are three, broadly speaking, types of benefit risk assessment. There's the generic type. So you encounter that if you buy a standard. For example, on playground equipment, that's a generic assessment because it's written by people far away in a working group who don't know your local circumstances. They can't possibly know them, and they're writing a generic statement which tries as best it can to cover all eventualities. But you, if you're responsible for a particular location or a particular situation which has special requirements, you're going to have to apply that standard thoughtfully and do a site-specific or situation-specific risk assessment. There's no getting away from that. You would have to do that, taking account of local circumstances and needs, your policy, for example. And then lastly, we've got the dynamic benefit risk assessment, which is my favourite really, because this is what people do second by second, moment by moment, when they're, say, looking after children, supervising a play situation, taking old folks like me on a ramble in the mountains, constantly monitoring how people are coping and the weather situation and all those kind of things, and then making decisions as they go along. And that's the people with contributory expertise who are best positioned to make those decisions. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand back to Marguerite now.
Okay, thank you very much, David. That was absolutely wonderful, and I just can't thank the panel enough for telling us such a moving and compelling story. And I feel in the kind of visual book that we're talking about that we are inching towards a happy ending here. If we've got risk and benefit equally matched, I think we've got to the stage where we might be trying to write the final chapter, which is very much about improving children and young people's health and well-being. And if we do that, I think we'll be improving all our own health and well-being. So it's been quite a journey. It hasn't happened overnight. I'm delighted to be here with the panel who have played such a pivotal role in making these changes. But I'm sure many of you out there have also played your own contribution. And so we're about to take a quick 5-minute break, and we're going to hand over to yourselves, and we would welcome any questions that you have for the panel. So 5 minutes, see you soon. Thank you. Hello and welcome back to the panel. And we have a lot of questions to try and fit in. So the first one I have here for the panel is, what is the role of insurance companies in enabling risky play, and how are they being engaged with on this issue? Who would like to start? David?
You're looking at me.
I'm looking at you, David.
Well, it's... Microphone? I beg your pardon.
Sorry, we're just getting the microphone sorted here.
I'll try and break the equipment. I probably will. No, I've got it. Right, okay, well, that's a multifaceted question with a very complicated answer. I only know a little bit of it, but insurance companies have sometimes upset the play community because they've been a bit heavy-handed, we felt, on things like adventure playgrounds and forest schools and things like that. But I think, for everybody, all of us, including insurance companies, there is a learning process here, because if we're going to incorporate consideration of benefits, we must relax some of the pressure on the elimination of risk and make these balanced decisions. And I think at the end of the road, it's actually going to improve things for insurance companies, because a lot of the claims which are made when people have been injured are a bit silly, and if you were to factor in the benefits which people get from carrying out certain activities, these things wouldn't even go to court. So that would relieve them of some pressure. So it's a golden chalice for them if they can grasp it. And I'm sure someone else would like to say.
Thanks, David. On the specific question about engaging with insurers, it's actually not so easy, or at least it hasn't been so easy for the Play Safety Forum. But I'm pleased to say that we do now have a representative from the insurance sector who is a part of the forum, and who in fact has already been very helpful in exploring some of the issues. But I did also just want to say a couple of other points. It's worth remembering insurers have a fairly clear structural role, if you like, that they offer a service to give a kind of financial safety net in case things go wrong. Okay, so their very strong focus is on mitigating the financial risks. So, I don't think it's the insurer's job to get too heavily involved in the nitty-gritty of that trade-off between risks and benefits. I think they should be aware that that's what's going on, but that actually it's for the provider, for those involved in providing the service or the space, to be clear about what they want to be doing, and then to seek out insurance cover that offers that financial safety net. And if we get too far away from that, things can get quite kind of muddied up. And I'll give you an example from the Forest School world. For my sins, I'm the patron of the Forest School Association here in the UK. And we had a case, it was a few years ago now, where insurers started getting very nervous about the use of rope swings in forest school sessions. And there was lots of insurers saying they were going to withdraw cover or raise premiums hugely, and it's quite an involved thing. And in the end, that was resolved by actually getting around the table where forest school providers and I think some of the associations actually presented a case for why this matters, and some basic kind of good practice guidance that they offered, which then reassured the insurance world that actually this was not something to get too stressed about. So I think there are lessons there about how you can get that dialogue with the insurance sector. Andy, do you want to? Yes, I'm going to hand over to Andy as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so just to sort of add to the previous answers, for me, insurers will be making a financial judgment. What is the risk that there will be a claim? How much will that claim likely cost? So I think they will be looking to the legal system, and I think, where this benefit risk principle could be most helpful to insurers, as well as a lot of other stakeholders, is if in legal claims, that there is much more of a judgment made of the benefits of the activity, versus the particular circumstances of an accident, which is, normally horrible, and it's normally very difficult to say that, no one is responsible. But if you follow the principles of benefit risk, sometimes that is the case. It is just an unfortunate accident. So if we can get the benefit risk principle more embedded at a legal context in court judgments, I think that will filter down to insurance companies, and it'll filter down to a lot of other stakeholders as well.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have a question here from Vince in the beautiful mountains of Mourne, saying, fantastic achievement to get the ISO across the line. Really interested in how the ISO could be applied to things that aren't designed for play, specifically. So probably the natural outdoors, the beaches, the lovely hills there.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Vince. We have to remember, as I said, the scope of the standard. It's not just about playgrounds and playground equipment. It's all sport and recreational activity. So it can be applied anywhere, particularly. And so I think, when you're going to a beach, you do a benefit risk assessment. When you're going to up a mountain, you do a benefit risk assessment. I really remember that it's a much wider scope than just for play and playgrounds.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm seeing some examples here, like trees and streams and things like that. Yes.
Can I come in as well? I mean, I think if you're thinking about other built things like squares and public spaces, then there will be other safety considerations, and depending on where you're based, regulations and so on. And I think this kind of goes to David's point in his talk about that this ISO is pretty revolutionary. It is a game-changing move, and that it might take time, but I think it does have implications even beyond the kind of narrow scope of, or comparatively narrow scope of, sports and recreation. After all, people spend time in public spaces as part of their leisure. We linger, we choose to enjoy those spaces, and some of what we, and in particular some of what children might do in public spaces that are not playgrounds, might have an element of risk. So I think there's a pathway for this ISO to have an impact in those sorts of contexts. But again, it might take time, and it also might take some at least legal and professional debate before we get there. We just had a slight technical interlude here. Does anybody else want to chip in on that question? I have an example, actually, of a public space feature where a benefit risk process was used to justify non-compliance with an existing playground standard, and it's sometimes called the bird cage, and it's a swing inside a bird cage. And if you ever visit King's Cross Station in London, which I was in yesterday, I can tell you it's still there. So you can picture it. It's a swing inside a cage. It's clearly non-compliant with the relevant safety standards for playground equipment, but the people who oversee that structure carried out their own benefit risk assessment some years ago now, and indeed got it signed off by their own insurers and legal people. So I thought that was, even before the ISO came into being, there's some context where you're offering these sort of unusual or flexible or innovative play opportunities where a benefit risk or risk benefit philosophy can be helpful.
Thank you very much, Tim. So another question here from Hamish Orr, who's up on the west coast of Scotland, near Fort William, and he's got a question. Sport and play are often conflated on a policy level. How do you think this affects policy making for play?
Okay, I'm going to stick my neck out and say that feels a little bit beyond the scope of this particular seminar. I mean, I'm sure each of us have views on the relationship between sport and play. I mean, I'll just say one thing. I've seen a growing interest amongst people involved in sport in children's play in the last year or two. This is in the UK.
Yep.
I think it's also happening in New Zealand, where in fact it's Sport New Zealand, as I understand it, is really the lead agency for play. I think broadly speaking that's a good thing. I mean, historically there have been some, over the decades, tricky relationships between planet sport and planet play, but I think they're not the same. But I think actually culturally we're more clear about the differences between sport and play these days, and particularly that very basic point about play being something that's freely chosen, where children are in control, whereas sport is more structured around kind of rules and so on. So I think given that, I'm hoping, and I can see some more constructive conversations around benefits, actually around health benefits, well-being benefits, and also around play as a kind of when children are playing, they're getting some of that physical literacy, some of that sort of basic insights into what their body can do that is also of interest to sports world. But I suspect, as I say, that if we pursue that too much more, we might take us into a different seminar.
I'm thinking of Article 31, which talks about play and recreation, also allowing children to be bored as well, culture and the arts. So it's quite broad, but we're not talking about formal play here. Formal sport, sorry. No such thing as formal play, I don't think. So I don't have any more questions coming up on my screen. So just looking at our team over here. Oh yes, there was a question that we don't have up in front of us just now, but someone from New Zealand was asking who else was on the Standards Committee. So, Harry.
Yes, if I can answer that. I mean, first of all, to explain, people get nominated onto standards committees and working groups for standards committees by being nominated by the national standards organisations. And when they get to the working group, which in this case was a working group of a main technical committee, they're there as individual experts. They're not there to represent their nation. That's the strict way of doing it. Very often it's not the case in practice, but because they're operating from their own national experience. I haven't got a list of the full participants, but certainly the USA and Canada were well represented, Japan was represented, China was represented, and many European countries were represented. I'm afraid for our New Zealand questioner, there was nobody there from New Zealand, but their neighbours, Australia, had good representation. And I can remember a couple of the names. Professor David Eager was very heavily involved, and a guy called Andrew Reedy. So if you can get any references to those by Googling them, that'd be a good start. But if not, I'm sure you can find a way to get this information so we can give you contact details.
Thank you very much, Harry. Okay, I've got another question here. We work with schools who desperately want to provide risk and challenge, but they are stopped from implementing things from their health and safety advisors. Any advice? Anyone want to take this one? Okay. So
If I may start.
I think maybe everyone will have something to say on this one.
I've come across this question more in nurseries than but also in primaries, particularly about this. And I would start by saying the person who's in charge of those children, say those 30 children, 5 days a week, I don't know how many weeks a year, is the expert about those children. The health and safety expert, so-called, or person from the health and safety department comes in and gives them some comment about safety, health and safety in their circumstances. For me, that is just advice. The real expert, whether Jane can manage those stairs on her own or Johnny can manage those stairs on her own, that's an individual equation. And so I would start by saying for teachers and for nursery or early years practitioners, I think as they're called these days, have confidence in your own competence about those children. You know what they're capable of as individuals, and you can do, as David said, you'll be doing every minute of your working day a dynamic risk assessment about those children. The health and safety person coming in can give you some general advice about that, but you have to temper that by your knowledge of those children, and you're the expert about those children, not the person that comes in once a year to do that. I mean, that's more campaigning than actual, because I know in practice people are frightened to get that advice and not take it. But I think they should have, as I said, confidence in their own, confidence in their own competence.
That's great, thanks. I think David's looking to come in as well, but that's a great phrase to remember,
Yeah.
confidence in your own competence.
Well, I come across a lot of situations where people who are running activities, maybe a nursery or school play or something like that, where the teachers and the activity leaders have been told by the health and safety person, you can't do that because we've done a risk assessment. Well, the difficulty is that I mean, I've got health and safety qualifications, but I know darn well that those qualifications include 0 about child development, 0 about the activities involved, and that the person probably doesn't actually know anything about what's going on in the classroom or the playground or the situation. And so it's just inappropriate that they should have the final say on what goes on. And as Harry says, it's the contributory expertise of those people who are actually looking after the children, know them on a personal basis perhaps, which is the really, really important thing. So somehow we've got to get to that position whereby we re-enfranchise people who are actually in the front line, that is the teachers, the play workers and people of that kind. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Yes, Tim.
I mean, just to really bang home, the ISO is a Christmas present for people who are in this situation. What does it say? It precisely says that it's a new tool for managing risk, okay? So your health and safety people, I'm guessing, just won't be aware of it. And what the ISO does in pointing it out is give legitimacy, and it takes it out of just a conversation that says, you're saying this thing, I'm saying this other, or I want to do this other thing. And instead it presents a framework, and hopefully a framework that those involved in health and safety will be able to appreciate is a response to a real problem. And the real problem is around excessive risk aversion. And there are lots of case studies I mentioned in my talk, schools here in the UK that are running a program called Opal, which has got great examples of activities and offers and loose parts that children can use in school break times. That's a case study and a precedent that other schools can point to. The final thing I just say is that and any school who's been in that Opal program will say this, and I think we would probably say it as well here on this panel. This is a kind of journey. I know that's an overused metaphor, but look for sort of initial steps and maybe confidence building measures and maybe pilots or ways to set off on this journey towards expanding the offers and the opportunities that you make for your children. You might not get everything that you want right at the outset, but I'm sure that with the ISO in your back pocket, you can make some progress.
Okay, Andrew.
Thank you. I mean, within the play industry, and as Harry covered before, it's implicit that an inspector, has a broader knowledge, which includes, the value of play. And certainly, we have seen that inspectors which come in, from more of a factory setting, haven't necessarily got those tools. So I think what this standard does, it makes those tools available much more widely. And, like Tim said, I think this is now a tool that can be used in all recreational settings. So, that should really help going forward, I hope.
Super, thank you. Now, this is from Dr. Sarah Goldsmith, who is a lecturer in childhood practice lecturer. And as we know, language is very important, and she's interested in this change of the language from risk-benefit to benefit-risk. So I think it's highly significant, so I think she'd like to know more about.
And I think David or Harry might speak to that. Hello, Sarah.
Those of you who are on the committee, please tell us, because we're delighted about the change in language, but how did that come about?
Well, when the working group started its job of writing this standard, the word benefit did not appear in the title at all. It was just about risk assessment of sport and recreational activities. But after the first few meetings, the mood changed significantly, and benefits was way up on the agenda. And not only that, but the members of the working group demanded that benefits become the first word rather than risk, to emphasize its incredible importance. So that's how it happened, through a protracted conversation.
Brilliant.
Harry, do you want to say
No,
anything?
that's absolutely
Super.
fine and correct.
Great. Well, I think it's the right way around now, which is fantastic. Okay, now this is from Disability Shetland. I have to say, I'm looking out here at Arthur's Seat in the sunshine, and I'm delighted that all these lovely people from other parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland and New Zealand are giving us questions. So from Disability Shetland, which must be looking gorgeous today, it's a statement, but I'd like people to comment on it. It says, we need to ensure that disabled children and, to an extent, disabled adults and those with ASN have the opportunity to take risks in play provision. Do you think the ISO standard will support this, particularly, specifically?
In two ways, I think it will. I mentioned in the definitions about graduated challenge, when I was talking about definitions in the start of the standard, and this is in relation to children of all competences, as the words that the standard use. And more we are getting, even in the standards world, along this road from accessibility to inclusion, which is recognizing by far that there are a lot of so-called hidden disabilities which we didn't take account of before. Just a symbol that we use for accessibility was a wheelchair, for example. Not decrying wheelchair accessibility is really important. But this idea of graduated challenge for children of all abilities is very much embedded in the standard. And you know, there are more and more people are interested in taking that route further down the road towards inclusion. I would add that the working group has now started on a next piece of work, and these pieces of work take 3 to 5 years at an international level, and the work is on inclusion in play spaces. So they're already taking this another step further down this line, and I hope our caller from Shetland will be happy with that answer.
It sounds very positive. And I think very much what David was saying, in some ways we've got to the starting line, but it will take time for this change to become embedded. So from Laura Patterson, do you have any advice for schools struggling to develop opportunities for risk? And these are schools who are owned by building firms with strict health and safety guidance. Now,
Do we know where Laura is?
I don't know where Laura's coming in from. Do we know where Laura's joining us from? And maybe an Opal School programme? Yes.
Okay.
So these, I know in Scotland we have schools that are owned private, public,
Right.
partnership schools. I'm sure there's similar elsewhere in the country and across the world.
I think I'll probably underscore what I said earlier about, so, you know, look to where there will be other schools that are in that situation. What can you learn from their experience? Opal itself, I mean, I have great respect for Michael Follett and his team. I'm sure they'll have some ideas, and trying to see where you can find some scope for constructive conversation about change, and if there's real resistance, and just figuring out what baby steps along the way you can take that might, you know, prove to be kind of confidence building measures to demonstrate that some of those anxieties are actually, you know, not borne out by the reality.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, Margaret,
No, on you go,
may I?
please do.
I'm afraid my answer may be a little harder than Tim's. Very often in my experience, people use health and safety as an excuse because they don't want to think about the complexity of a better answer, if you like, or dealing with it in a more complex way. So I would as well as doing the little steps that Tim talks about, on those little steps, ask just simple childlike questions. Why? So why is it health and safety issue? What is a health and safety issue? Just a bit of childlike questioning to get to them to give you more information on which to base those conversations.
And actually, I'm going to say one more thing,
Okay,
which I'm
Just look at the time.
I was kind of outbidding Harry again a bit. No, it's a very good point. Don't just take no for an answer. But there are some real life examples of where schools or settings have really pushed against an initial kind of resistance. And in fact, one of them, and we have to give credit to the Care Inspectorate for their transparency about this, is the Care Inspectorate. I'm trying to remember the timeline, but 10 or 15 years ago, when settings here in Scotland were wanting to develop full outdoor early years provision, so basically no building, the Care Inspectorate was having real problems with that, and effectively was saying, no, you can't do that. I think the main specific issue was hand washing, but it was clearly about safety, and those settings, really pushed hard, and I think possibly went to the press at one point, or so that it can be a nuclear option, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves, this is a big conversation about how we can give children more opportunities to be outdoors, to be in nature, to get a sense of their own agency, find out from their own efforts and their own mistakes. And, nobody really disagrees that we need to be doing that. And in fact, every week I see more stories in the media about, declining children's mental health and well-being. So, the big picture is that the climate is, I think, still changing in favour of opening up children's opportunities for risk and uncertainty in play. So, it's not always easy, and sometimes you need to fight pretty hard, and sometimes you need to be nice.
We definitely have culture change in Scotland, and I think there's 50 outdoor nurseries now. So, it just takes time, doesn't it, for things to change?
I might say a little thing or two. I come across this problem frequently in all kinds of different walks of life, even, looking after trees and stuff like that. Sometimes engineers, civil engineers want to cut them all down because they may fall on somebody and cause injury. On the other hand, trees are beautiful things, and especially in this age of climate change, we really should be looking after them and proliferating them. So there are big questions, but the trouble is, sometimes when you're dealing with civil engineers, they have protocols which they're embedded in, and they don't think outside of them. It's as if they've got a gigantic algorithm for decision making, and it doesn't include you or your children or your benefits. This is going to be a big struggle, and it's one that we have to take on, I think. And it's going to take, that's why I say it's going to take a while for this new ISO to permeate.
Okay, thank you. Now, I've lost Damien Puddle's question, so I'm going to go to the next question, and we might put his question back, if that's okay. So this is from someone called Robin Sutcliffe, former chair of the Play Safety Forum for many years. What are the main differences between the new ISO standard and the Play Safety Forum recommendations, if any? So is there still a gap? We're all looking to you, David.
Me? You're looking
for
at
the
me?
detail. We're looking at you for the detail.
Well, thank you, Robin, for that question. The main differences. Well, first of all, this is an international standard. I think the views expressed in it, the ideas expressed, are very consistent with the work the PSF has been doing for 30 years. I haven't thought of any clashes myself. I think that it's a great thing that the PSF's initiatives have contributed to this new blossoming of this new way of thinking. I don't see any problems.
Great. Tim's got his hand up. I hope to agree, not to disagree. Yeah, go for it, Andy.
Well, I was just going to say, I think the ISO group owes Robin a debt of gratitude in starting this work 30 years ago. So
yeah, well said.
And I just want to add on a kind of, yes, aside from basking in reflected glory and so on, and giving due credit. It is true, I think, that the ISO, benefit risk runs through the ISO like, letters through a stick of rock. So that's there. The particular approach that we set out in the Play Safety Forum in our, let's now call it benefit risk assessment process, is but one of a whole range of possible ways of doing a benefit risk assessment. I think it might be the only one that's included in the standard. Anyway, but it's included as an annex. So if you like, it's a case study or an example or a recognised piece of best practice. But elsewhere in the ISO, I know it recognises that there are different ways of doing benefit risk assessments. So just in that kind of logical sense, if you like, the ISO is quite permissive about how you do a benefit risk assessment, and isn't prescriptive about saying you should be doing it this or that way. But you should be thinking about benefits alongside risks, and there's a nice flow chart in the standard that shows that.
Super. Okay, Damien Puddle, we have your question back. Thank you. Further to my question regarding a quantitative approach, which I'm sorry I don't have, given David's comments, how might we influence council management to believe that the subjective narrative approach that we're talking about here is valid and satisfactory? So I suspect that's as distinct from a scoring matrix or something like that. So how do we approach local authorities and convince them that subjective is good?
I can
Yes,
start
go
on
for
that
it.
if you like. It's the end result is a judgment, and I think, as Tim has just said, the standard is not prescriptive as how you come to that judgment. So I think it's up to individuals, it's up to organisations to select the tool or the process which best fits, the way that they work. So, I do have a slightly different view to David, who I know is against a numerical approach. Personally, I quite like numbers as a way of scaling things. So, certainly I'm not adverse to a numerical approach in the same way that David is. But that's with the recognition that what comes out at the end is a judgment. Yes. So it's just what tool you use to make that judgment, I think, is quite a personal choice.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that sounds good.
Yep, I realise that Andy has a slightly different take on this than I do. I'm a scientist, I'm a physicist actually, and I love numbers. I'm happy when I'm dealing with them. But in this situation, I just feel that you cannot put a numerical value on some of these quantities that we're thinking about, like kids being happy, having a good play experience, getting health benefits. It's just not possible to put a number on it. If you do put a number on it, it's subjective. It's not objective. So even though you've got a number, it's still subjective. And I just feel it's a bit deceptive sticking numbers on these things.
Okay. I've got a hard question for Andy coming up here from Tim Rollison. I'm going to you first because you mentioned it. How will ISO 4980, which is the one we're here talking about, inform or feed into EN 1176? Okay, so,
obviously in my presentation I sort of spoke about, what I consider to be the foundation that EN 1176 provided, which, perhaps was part of the springboard for this work. And as I also said in the presentation, sort of standards groups will generally follow the mood of the crowd. They will sort of follow public expectation. So if this ISO, is really instrumental in shifting public expectation, much more along this direction of travel that we need, more challenge, more challenge, more challenge, then I would see that feeding in to the standards as they develop going forward.
Okay. Super, that's great. Do we have any more questions? Yep. So what studies are taking place to assess objective likelihoods of injury rather than the subjective opinion? So are there studies going on to replace this? David?
Well, I have deeply regretted,
Okay.
ever since 2002 that the United Kingdom dropped out of the European Home and Leisure Accident Surveillance System. That gave us reliable data on injury rates in play and all other kinds of activities in Britain, and it was absolutely essential for a country that prides itself on being a risk-based society. That is, a society which manages risk and isn't in the false game of trying to eliminate it. But since we've dropped out, we have lost a very important ingredient. And I know that organisations like ROSPA have campaigned to try and get the British government to reintroduce this injury surveillance system. And I can only say I wish them the greatest luck. It is really, really important that we do that.
And I heartily agree, but just to add, in other countries, I think there are mechanisms. I recall seeing a post, I think it was on LinkedIn, and I now can't remember who it was from, but it was somebody who did quite a detailed analysis of New Zealand accident statistics that essentially, from memory, reflected the picture from David's work of 20 years ago around playground accidents, that they are comparatively rare, and particularly that serious accidents are comparatively rare. So you may find, if you dig around in your own area, that you can get some handle, but it's not. David's right. It's not easy in the UK and in some other countries to get reliable statistics.
So, if public opinion is the driver for standards, how do we continue the shift towards a less risk-averse culture in regards to play?
I'm going to say, I think, I don't want to put words in Andy's mouth, but I don't think, I wouldn't say for myself that public opinion is necessarily the driver for standards. I think standards tend to reflect, or at least respond to, changes in public opinion, but they're also, as we've heard already, they reflect and respond to other pressures as well, around trade and around emerging science and so on. So I think the bigger question is, how is there still a need to build the case for giving children more freedom and play in their lives? And I would say yes, there is. And that's a kind of, if you like, a value judgment on my part, and I'm guessing probably shared by many people who are on this webinar. And you know, we just need to keep on pushing for that expansion in children's freedoms.
I mean, purely from a standard representation point of view, you know, as I said before, we do have consumers represented within the standards groups. And in my experience, you know, they are quite often the biggest anchor. I think they feel a very strong social responsibility towards children, and, you know, using the safety word. So I think if we empower them much more in terms of benefits of challenge, then, you know, we will see a shift coming through in that way.
Yeah, a very important aspect of this question is you can have legislative change, you can have policy standards change, you can have policy change, but very often it's not followed so easily by cultural change. And there are a number of examples that many of us have been involved in whereby, say, schools or a nursery has pushed the boundaries a bit, and the reaction has come back that the parents want them to be more cautious. And they've had to deal with the parents to bring them along. It's an important piece of work I've just read about in Canada, which is guidance for paediatricians to have a dialogue with parents about risky play. I've only just read it, so I haven't really digested it yet, but it seems to me that that sort of work needs to go on to show to anxious parents, generally with a good motive for wanting to protect their children, obviously, that this motive, although good, may be damaging to their children later on. And that, as Sunset has said, this ethical question about the two good motives is one which we have to get across to people.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much. That was our last question. It's been a fantastic session and seminar. I want to say a huge thank you to our panel here today for the difference they're making to children's lives, children here and now in real time, but children who are not even born yet. I think it will take time for the implications of this standard to work its way through, and for all of us to work out how we can use it to change the culture and practice of children's play opportunities across the world. So thank you to the panel, thank you to all of you for watching us today, and I hope that this has helped you on your journey in terms of improving things, improving play opportunities for children everywhere. Thank you very much.